Hi everyone, my name's Charlee Ryman. I'm one of the co-founders of Trident Search, and I'm delighted to be joined today on our Trident Talks episode by none other than Merlin Namuth, who's CISO and Director of Advisory Services, was formerly Lodestone, but now Beazley, right?
Yeah, Beazley Security. Yeah, so we're owned by Beazley Insurance.
Awesome. Thanks so much for joining us today. Pleasure to kind of have you on. We've got some really good conversational topics we're going to discuss. They could take us hours, but we're going to try and do this in about 10-15 minutes. So Merlin, for those that don't know who you are, would you like to kind of give a quick introduction?
Yeah, absolutely. Merlin Namuth. I'm located in Denver, Colorado. As Charlie said, I am the Director of Advisory Services at Beazley Security. I'm also the CISO of our company. So leading up to this, I've been in cybersecurity for a little over 25 years now. I started off my career hands-on engineering, architecture, incident response, digital forensics, and then I moved into the leadership side of security. And for the leadership side of my career, Beazley Security is now the sixth security program that I've led in my career. The third one with the CISO title. I always make that distinction because I've had the three other programs I led, I didn't have the CISO title, and the responsibilities are very different. At least what I experienced. Like I didn't report to the board, but when I had CISO title, then I reported to the board. So I always make that distinction when I introduce myself.
Sure. And I can imagine now there's a lot of people in two minds whether to adopt that title with certain regulations and restrictions coming into play. But I can totally understand why you kind of got that. And it must be really, you must have a really strong background getting all those different kind of verticals within security to now obviously head up those advisory services. So you must be really well placed to understand what's good, what's bad, and how to actually offer that good service to customers, right?
Yeah, no, I've been fortunate in my career. I mean,
Mm.
luck definitely plays into some of that, of course. Also hard work. I've worked across several different industries, so I understand, how to secure companies that are in retail or fintech, financial services. Let's see what else, oil and gas. So those are just a few of the different industries that I've worked across. So it's been interesting, and I've been able to gain a lot of knowledge through that, and then also just some circumstances that were beyond my control. Like one of the security programs I ended up leading was a sporting goods retailer called Sports Authority, and the company ended up going bankrupt, and I was leading the security program as the company was going through bankruptcy, and I'm like, so what do I do? And I actually I did some Google searching to see if anybody had given any talks or there's any white papers or anything on, like, how do you navigate, trying to keep a company secure that doesn't have money to spend because they're going out of business, but you still got to keep everything secure while the company's being shut down. And I didn't actually come across anything. And then I kind of had this epiphany that I was like, oh, I'm the one who has to give that talk. So I took pages and pages of notes when we were going through that, like the different situations we ran into. Like there was one day that we had to turn down like 350 user accounts in one day. And my team was responsible for doing that. It's like, okay, so we sat down, we planned it out. We had a script to run to take, remove the accounts in Active Directory. But then, we had applications that weren't tied in Active Directory. So, we had people assigned that would go in those applications and manually remove accounts. So, so it's quite interesting. And so I ended up giving a presentation at the RSA conference on how to keep a company secure it's going out of business. So I actually had a few people reach out to me. They're like, yeah, we're running into that too. And, thank you for sharing those experiences.
Well, I'm sure that's beneficial for you for your career, right? To have that experience, but obviously not great for the organization, unfortunately, and everyone else that kind of works there. But
Yeah.
would you, in that particular instance, I mean, I'm not sure because I don't really speak to people that have actually had that experience, but would you kind of treat it as any other incident? If it's like a major P1 and there's denial of service, you can't operate as a business. Is there some kind of similarity there, do you think?
Yeah, I can see some similarity because,
Yeah.
we were, I wouldn't say we were in crisis mode, but things were definitely elevated.
Mhm.
And so, one of the things that we ran into is that we had an IPS solution, and the maintenance ran out on it. And I reached out to the vendor. I'm like, hey, I need to renew the maintenance for like 6 months because the company is going to be completely shut down in 6 months. and the vendor refused to do that. And so then we had to get creative, and fortunately, it was like a few months before they ended up going bankrupt. We'd replaced the firewalls, and with those particular firewalls that we bought, the first year, all the functionality was enabled by default, even though we didn't pay for it. That's just how they did their licensing. So we ended up just turning on IPS on the firewall, so that way we still had that kind of level of protection and updated signatures through that. So there's just like different things that we had to navigate through that of, and also, I was trying to make sure that my vendors were getting paid. So I had to go talk to finance because everything is being scrutinized as to, what money was being paid out for things.
Yeah, I can imagine. I really want to get onto the whole myth debunking that you do, but before I do that, I've got one more question around that. The whole bankruptcy piece. You mentioned a vendor refused to kind of give you a 6-month kind of like either extension or contract. How supportive were all the other vendors within that at that point of time? Were they quite flexible with their SLAs without, yeah, we can kind of help out, or were they all just kind of like, well, actually, we're not there to support you because we don't know if you're going to be able to pay us to some degree?
Yeah, it's funny because the way you ask that question, it actually ties into some of the myths that I debunk, and
Ah,
and you'll see why as I describe this. So, it really came down to relationships, and one of the things that I always tell the people on my team, my security team, is that yeah, we want good service from our vendors, but we also need to be a good partner to our vendors as well. Now, if a vendor's not doing what they're supposed to and they're giving us bad service, it's like, okay, well, that's a different story. But if a vendor is doing a good job, then we shouldn't be jerks to them. We should treat them with respect and be partners to them. And if we see something that, hey, it'd be nice if you had this feature in your product, or oh, this isn't working quite right, that we help them be better, because if they're better, it makes us better and
yeah,
more secure. And so yeah, it's just about relationships. And so tying into the myths is that one of the things that I talk about. So I started this truths or myths kind of blog that I do on LinkedIn once a month, and I just tackle things that people say in security that aren't necessarily accurate, and or I try to just challenge and people to think differently and to consider a different perspective on things. And how it ties in with the people relationship is that, I'm sure, Charlie, you've heard a lot of people say, well, security needs to be aligned to the business. You've probably heard that many times, right?
definitely.
One of the things I talk about is that people don't really consider the relationship aspect of that. It's like, if you're aligned to the business, you also need to be aligned to the people. I mean, the business is made up of people, and so you need to have have relationships with people across the organization, the different department leaders and such. And so, because a lot of times when people talk about aligning to the business, they're talking about like, oh, what's the risk appetite of the organization? What's the company spending money on to drive revenue, and where does security, fit into that? Which are all good things, but people stop short of that, and it's like you have to include the relationship aspect of that too, because it's a lot of give and take. It's like, the business might be investing a lot of money to develop a new application that's going to generate more revenue, but working with the application leader, they might be like, yeah, well, we can we can spend a little bit less here, so you can get in some sort of like static analysis tool or something like that, that benefits both sides. So
It's really interesting you mentioned that. There's someone else that I spoke to, another senior leader in the UK actually, and she had a really, really good point. Exactly what you're saying. Any kind of issue within security or even within a business can be solved by people. If you get everyone on
mhm.
side and everyone doing the right thing, it's gonna solve the issue. So you're 100% right in what you're saying. And if I were to digress just a little bit, then we can come back to the myths. You made a point around you saying that you've been quite lucky within your career, but what's quite evident so far, and what you don't see too often, is someone really passionate about what they do. So your 3 points that you've mentioned is, it was obviously you're doing this whole truth or myth thing, which is great. It's fantastic, raising awareness and challenging people, which is really good. You say people are one of the most important things within the organization or within the business. You need to be aligned to the
Mhm.
people. Not a lot of people say that. Um, And then also you kind of mentioned this around partnerships, especially when it comes to vendors. It's like, well, actually, yes, we expect this service, but we also, as you said, we can't be jerks to our partners. So those three kind of perspectives, I think they're kind of testaments to kind of obviously where you are now. And I think those traits are actually quite hard to kind of come by. So just want to say like kudos to you for kind of doing all that as well. But then back to the truth or myth, aside from we need to be aligned to the business, what are a few other kind of key myths that you tend to seem like you're constantly debunking, which should seem like common sense?
Yeah, another one that, and it's actually my very first post, is when I started doing this, is people will say, oh, we have a shortage of IT, or I'm sorry, security people, which not so much right now because of the tight job market, but a few years ago that was the case. It's hard to find people. And I often heard my peers saying, oh, well, it's because HR creates unrealistic job descriptions. And I was like thinking about that. I'm like, no, that's not really accurate. It might be it might be in some cases, but I think most of the time that's not accurate because as a hiring manager, I create my own job descriptions. HR approves them, of course, or they have input on it, and HR has access to all sorts of tools that can help generate good job descriptions. So you don't have to necessarily do it from scratch, but you're working with HR to come up with a good job description, and they approve it, you approve it, and then it gets posted. So yeah, so I talk about that. But I've heard so many people say that, and I'm like, it's just not. Now, in some large organizations, I've heard people say that that is the case, that they really have no control over that. It's like, okay, but I think that's more. Yeah, I just don't think that happens near as much as what people like to
Do you
say.
think there's a world where job descriptions don't exist? Could you hire without a job description?
I have. Well, I was gonna say I have before, but that's not really accurate because I ended up creating a job description. But I've been in a position where I needed to hire for a role, and someone who had worked for me before was in the job market, and so I got approval to hire him. So I hired without a job, the job being posted. But I don't think I've ever hired without a job description because I mean you really need to have that job description so that way both you and the employee or the job candidate have a good understanding of what the expectations are for the job.
Mhm. The only reason I say that is because I agree. I don't think there's as many JDs out there which just are given off well, what that myth's saying. But sometimes when I do look at JDs and I speak with customers and I say, let's forget the JD, for example. Tell me the three key things that you need this person to do within the role on the day-to-day basis.
Mm-hmm.
And then tell me what the extracurricular, the bonus points are, if you will. And then we can go to market and we go, bang, we go to it. And then sometimes candidates on the flip side say, well, actually, can you send me the job description after we've had that initial kind of qualification
Mm-hmm.
call? And then it's like almost like a bit of a misrepresentation of the role, and they're like, oh, it's completely different. So there is, I
Yeah.
think, but that's just because a lot of people get they kind of misunderstand the extracurricular skill sets that are needed, or the bonus
Mm-hmm.
points. So it's just an interesting topic. How about
Yeah.
any other myths that you kind of come across?
Uh, yeah. I've heard people say that like security awareness training doesn't work, and basically they just kind of want to abandon that. I don't necessarily agree with that because I always like to approach that people are trying to do the right thing. Now, of course, you're going to have like some people who just don't care. They're just they're just going to do whatever. And but I feel like you have to have security awareness training because I mean look at how I feel like it's a good success of the security industry as a whole that you go ask someone in the general public, and I would say at least 90% of them can say what phishing email is. I think that's a huge victory for our industry that the general public knows what this is. And that's security awareness training. Now, of course, that's happened differently. It's not like the annual security awareness training that we give within our companies, but the media has like caught onto it, and so they've talked about it. So people understand what that is. And one of the things I talk about in that particular myth is that you're still going to have people who are just going to do whatever. That like you give them the training, and they still just don't either they don't understand or they don't care. And once one illustration I gave with that myth was my wife and I went to Hawaiian Islands, and so we were doing some walking around in one of the national parks, and where there's a lot of volcanic activity, there's a lot of they call them steam vents, and so you could actually see steam coming out of the ground, and there's signs all over saying "Stay on the path." And there's actually a placard at one point that talked about a child who got severely burned because the child went off the path and fell into a steam vent. Sometimes you can't even see the vents. I mean, you just see the ground and grass, and you could step and you could like totally sink in and fall into a steam vent and get, seriously burned. And it's like, even though there was all these signs and warnings around, it's like we still saw people going off path, like, take their selfies and such. So, I mean, you're still going to have people who just are going to ignore, any sort of warnings or guidance.
I see that all the time. Sometimes I sit there and I look at signage. So I was I was getting the train home from one of the London stations the other day,
Okay.
and there was all these signs before you go down the stairs saying, "Hold on to the handrail." It's like, it actually said "accident hotspot." Please hold on to the handrail before you're going down the stairs. And I'm sitting there thinking, why are we at a point where we need to have all this like excess signage? But it's because people are still going off that path and falling into the vents, right?
Yeah.
And I think security awareness is still and always will be so important, because it's still something silly like 90% of attacks happen from insider threat or behavior,
Exactly.
user behavior and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, when you're talking about the train, I thought you were going to refer to the "Mind the Gap" signage that's all over.
Well, and that it's just I go to sleep and I'm like, mind the gap, because I hear it all the time. But someone they dropped their phone down there yesterday as well, down the gap, and it's just like, how is this happening? But we digress. So
Yeah.
there's an abundance of myths, and we're talking about user behavior or anything like that. But I'd love to get your thoughts on what happened on Friday with the mass outage. I think it's something to do like CrowdStrike represented something like 25% of the market, held 25% of market share or something like that. And now it's
Something like
estimated
that. Yeah.
around £40 billion worth of damage, and only I think something like 40 million was insured. So would love to kind of get your perspective on what actually happened, and then perhaps we can kind of follow up and close off with any recommendations on how we could avoid something like that happening ever again.
Yeah, it's very unfortunate that happened. That did
Yeah.
impact a lot of people. I do have to say that I'm proud of so many people in the security community who've like come out on LinkedIn and said, "Hey, this could happen to anybody," and because you see, I mean, I'm sure you saw your share of people like posting like mean memes and things like that about the CrowdStrike, and like it could happen to anybody. And look, we have to understand, as part of our, third party risk and even our incident response process that, you think about it, there's like what, I don't know. I haven't sat down to like actually create the list. So, but I was thinking about this, like we have like what, maybe 25 or 30 vendors that nearly every company uses in their IT environment. It's like, if something major happens to them, it's like, that's huge. A huge impact. Like SolarWinds, when they had their incident, that's huge impact. We've had other huge impacting incidents because people, so many people use those solutions. So we have to understand that there is a lot of risk with that. We've had AWS regions go down. That impacts a lot of organizations as well. So you just have to understand that and try to have some business continuity in place. Like, if you're like in AWS cloud, maybe you need to consider having a hybrid solution where you also have stuff in Azure that you can like fail over that, or GCP or something like that. It's a little bit tougher with CrowdStrike because you're not going to run multiple EDRs. It doesn't make sense. So, but I don't know, maybe, it could be one of those things where maybe you do run multiple EDRs. Maybe you have CrowdStrike on some systems, and you have a different EDR solution on other systems. So that way, if there was an impacting event with one of those vendors, that doesn't impact your whole environment. That's just really a call on the risk tolerance of the business of what they want to do. Some businesses recover quickly, and some really have really lingered and have not recovered very well.
I think that's a very valid point. I held an executive forum last night, and a lot of people were saying that exact kind of solution. Is there a way you can kind of mix up your environment and your tools or your vendors, and actually not be so reliant on one at any one time? Um, so I know that's quite hard because a lot of people struggle to get sign off for any kind of tooling or anything like
Exactly.
that. So it's not as easy as that. But your point around the industry coming together and actually saying, well, look, this can happen to anyone. We need to all kind of jump in and help out rather than kind of like scrutinize the vendors. I think what goes around comes around, and that's such an important thing to do.
Hmm.
In terms of, I guess, being prepared for this or anything like that, I a lot of our clients are starting to think about instant preparedness,
Hmm.
and how you can actually, be ready for something like this happening. I'm going to throw a curveball here and probably throw another like random myth
Okay.
over to you. This isn't kind of like pre-planned, so I'm sure you absolutely smash it anyway. But so there's a myth floating around that no matter what company you are, no matter what tooling you use, you're always going to get hit. If you're targeted by a particular APT group, they're going to find a way in eventually. And I guess if you're using a certain vendor, you've got to be prepared for that. In one instance, for that to kind of go down.
Hmm.
Would you say there's some truth in that, or would you say that's a myth?
I think there's truth in that for sure.
Okay.
I mean, the tool. I mean, we do the best that we can, but in certain organizations I've worked at, we dealt with APT, and they're very well funded. They're very good at what they do, and they will find a way to get in. And yeah, I mean, so you have all your tooling that you can in place, but you also have to just have good visibility. Like when I was at the RSA conference earlier this year, some of the leading industry experts were saying, if you're just starting off in your security journey with an organization, get visibility first. So maybe a SIM or MSSP or something like that. So that way you have visibility of what's going on in your environment, because they're like, stuff is going to happen. You need to know about it. You don't want the attacker to dwell in your environment for months at a time, and stealing all sorts of information and you don't even know about it. So yeah, I think we always have to be prepared for it. Now it's kind of hard to know, to be able to be prepared for every little thing that could happen. I mean, who would have thought, before 4 years ago that we'd have a global pandemic? It's like, I was working for an organization that was, had like a pandemic response, and I kind of chuckled at that. I'm like, that'll never happen. And, I mean, so it's
Wow.
really hard to prepare for that. But if you have a good incident response process, really, it shouldn't matter what the incident is. Your company should be able to work through that
Yeah, that was
by following the
apparent.
process.
That was apparent for me in my time in the military as well, because it was everything was process, 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 and it was just strummed into you so much to the point
Yeah.
where if anything did happen, you'd be like, okay, I need to do step one, step two, step three, and then by that time you're kind of processing and understand a different way to kind of combat whatever threat that may be. So, um, Merlin, that's been really, really interesting, really, really helpful. I'm sure there's going to be lots of people that want to reach out and potentially have a conversation, either to find out more about Beazley or to throw some more myths your way to kind of debunk. I'm sure you'll be happy for them to reach out. But I want to thank you so much for your time today. And it's been a real pleasure.
Yeah, thanks, Charlie. I appreciate it, and appreciate people listening to this. And if you want to reach out to me, LinkedIn is the best way. So feel free to connect me on LinkedIn.
Great. Thanks, Merlin.